click here. But yes, so I'm going to be presenting on ongoing dissertation research, but this is probably the most easily translatable, not entirely conceptual portion of what I'm doing. I'm looking at what I'm calling music information objects, and I'm looking at them as mainly through the lens of various music practitioners. So the purpose of my research is to understand how these unique properties are seen sort of cross-culturally by musicians, and I'm looking primarily at world music practitioners as opposed to Western classical or popular musicians, primarily because they're very understudied. They're not really a population that is seen as having any sort of unique information to convey to people who are developing systems, and their behavior is not studied because perhaps it's not seen as information behavior because they're not your typical library users. They don't have the need to really go to a library because nothing in the music library is relevant to them. So this is the reason for doing this research. And it's kind of a luxury too, because how often do you get to just go out and study people without a direct system application in mind? You know, it's kind of a luxury to do that. And my research questions for my entire dissertation, this is them, but what I'm really focusing on in this presentation are the first two. So what is this conceptual thing, the music information object, and how does it appear represented in its many forms? And so the last three questions are much more related to this whole process of knowledge and transmission and all of these questions about what is the difference between information and knowledge in the context of making music and being a musician. And so I'm looking also at what this will mean, not just for music information research, but for information science. So that's down the pipeline, but right now I'm focused on the first two. And with that in mind, here are my participants. So these are the folks that I've been talking to discover what music information objects are. The first person, and I should explain too, the approach for my research was primarily motivated by my own experiences as a music practitioner of a world music tradition. So the people that I chose to work with, their purposive sample, I didn't just go and email people that I didn't know. I chose these people because I wanted exemplars of their various traditions, and I wanted people that I knew would be very knowledgeable, very having the ability to speak about aspects of their tradition that you gain through a long time being steeped in it. So not someone who had taken a few classes or got a world music certificate after taking this ensemble, that ensemble, and that ensemble. I want people who really are deeply knowledgeable about something and can talk from a position of authority. So the first person was a jazz and classical pianist, and he also happens to be an Irish traditional musician, a former student of mine actually, but has been playing jazz and classical music for a very long time. Irish music more recently, so I didn't really ask him too much about Irish, but I would ask him some comparison questions too. And he's starting to get recognition for his music. He competed in the All-Ireland Championships in 3 categories, so he's definitely got skills. And so when I talked with him, he was the first interview I did, and I also wanted to have a bit of a baseline for looking at world music practitioners as opposed to classical and popular, if you want to put jazz in that category. So the second participant is in that pre-test or that baseline category, you might call it. And this person is a longtime harpist and harp instructor. And she has an impressive resume. She's got degrees from Eastman and has played under a lot of really famous conductor composers and has been teaching for a very long time and performing in quite a lot of venues. And so this person was also very much able to speak to a lot of classical norms about notation and the various aspects that are important to learning and processing music in the classical area. And this participant was the only person that discussed using a library. And also noted that she has her own library of materials that she draws upon mainly, but that she's very active in also using music library resources too, and directing her students to do that as well. The first world music participant that I talked with, she's a steel pianist and a renowned one at that. She's also an educator and has led steel pan ensembles. And also I should mention too that the interviews that I did, half were in person and half were remote, you might say. So most were done via Skype, but there was one interview that I conducted via international phone call and strange delay over speakerphone that I was also recording. So I had one iPhone talking and one iPhone recording. It was very nice. But this is one that I did via Skype, and she talked about the differences, which I found fascinating, between how steel pan is taught in Trinidad and Tobago and Caribbean area versus in the US, where most people are not fond of oral learning. And so there's these social media groups that are created to share arrangements of steel pan works. And she said that just doesn't happen. You know, you just, you can learn a piece entirely by ear, and I'll talk more about her later, but it was fascinating, some of the stories that she told me too of secrecy in the pan world. Very, very interesting. And so this interview was really, really fascinating. I talked with a musician who's both an expert in Hindustani and Carnatic music. So she had one family connection on one side, one family connection on the other, and she learned sitar and tabla. And she's very, very gifted in both and has recorded a lot and been a music critic. And so talking with her was really a huge contrast from having any need for notation or tangible materials. It was all oral learning, and the central elements to her were very different than, say, the centralmost elements of the harpist or even the jazz pianist. And so they each have their own system of weighting, you know, which objects are most important to them, which are really relevant and which are not. And I also spoke with a Latin jazz guitarist who has some training as well in pan South American musics. And so this was also a nice way of looking at some of these oral learning versus sheet music learning, because this person also is an educator. They're all educators, but this person has to teach students who are not at all familiar with learning in any way outside of through sheet music. And this was a great interview too. I spoke with a Lakota song and dancer, primarily dance, also song. So this person is actually not Lakota. He now teaches on a reservation, and he teaches the Lakota language, and he teaches them song. And it's really fascinating because he's more fluent and has a lot more song knowledge than a lot of the younger folks on the reservation, and the people in his classes. They have actually, he was talking about how they were developing an app so that they could have tons of song lyrics, and that they could use the lyrics and try and work on memorization and internalizing a lot of the language that way. This is my phone interview across the seas. So I should also mention that none of these pictures are the people I interviewed. I deliberately made sure that they sort of allude in some way to the person, but they're not at all. They're not at all the people that I interviewed. So I'm talking about them, but I'm not going to say who they are. That photo actually over there of the fiddle player is John Kelly, my teacher's father. So my musical grandfather, if you will. The person I spoke with, though, was not John Kelly, because he's no longer, but someone of my teacher's generation, maybe slightly older. And this person is a well-known fiddle player and knows my teacher really well, knows me through my teacher, so it was, you know, he was like, oh yeah, let's talk. But I don't know what Skype is, so, you know, give me a call between the hours. We'll talk. And so his interview is intriguing because he's of a different style of playing than my own teacher, but he's also a composer. A lot of the people I spoke to are also composers and arrangers. And he was sort of my outlier. And it was neat because I had a lot of assumptions going into this interview because of what my teacher tells me, and I'm sort of primed by what I know from him. And what he was saying to me is, information and knowledge, they're the same thing. Oh, I don't know, there's really no right or wrong. You can play a tune, and I guess I have no right to comment on it. And you know, he was very non-committal, and in a way I can understand that too. He might not have wanted to commit because he's not my teacher, so he's not really going to tell me everything. But this was a really interesting interview because he's also primarily an oral learner, and he's a composer, and he has written music, but other people transcribe it for him. And he's got this really neat website. You can go and listen to the tunes, and he's got them in a lot of different formats because he doesn't assume you read music. So he's got it all recorded, and it's really neat. And he was the one that said, oh, you should go to the Irish Traditional Music Archive. They've got this, you know, if you can, they've got these interactive things where you can click on it and hear the score. And for him, that was so neat, the wonders of technology. Like, he doesn't know what Skype is, but he knows about that, which is really cool. And so the next person I talked with is a Chinese traditional musician and plays the zheng, and is an educator and very, very knowledgeable person. This interview was equally as intriguing as the one with the sitar and tabla player, because there are a lot of similarities in terms of how religion and spirituality tie into things, and also the way time and memory are perceived. And the most recent interview I did was of a very old friend that has since moved away from Tallahassee, and he's a Ugandan musician, multiple instruments, so not just one, and that's just one right there, that's a harp instrument, but he's also a composer and an educator, and you know, we had this great discussion about what it even means to be a music practitioner, and you know, we're sparring back and forth with terminology, musician, composer, arranger, you know, what's the difference, and what if I'm just, you know, what if I just do music? And he finally conceded that, okay, music practitioner is a fine way of saying it, I guess that's it. This is the framework that I'm working from. This is the 3 meta-classes framework is something that I developed myself, that I'm working on trying to illustrate through this research. And so these 3 meta classes are ways of grouping these information objects, which are kind of conceptual, and they're not supposed to be grouped according to use or function, but more or less what they are. And it doesn't have to be, and the things that are contained within them don't necessarily have to be contained within them for every musical tradition. I know it doesn't make sense when I say it, but for instance, so the symbolic class, first of all, is the notation and the image-based class. So this would be transcriptions when you think of having something tangible written down, some thing. And then what I'm calling the interpretive class is not a performance, performance has certain connotations. So, but this is the sounding part. This is the part where whatever is up here as a conceptual music information object is then interpreted and created through sound, manifest through sound. Symbolic is just the way in which it's symbolized down here. So the derivative class is what you might call the context, but this is the irony. What may seem contextual or fringe is actually not fringe at all. It's actually at the center of everything. And the reason why I made them all equal is because in any situation, and as described by any one person, you could have something that conceivably is only in one, is in two but not three, or is in everything. And this is not necessarily a whole. You know, I'm not making a statement that if everything is present, that is a whole whatever. There is no whole. It's all relative, right? And so that's an important distinction because I'm not saying that there is such thing as a complete object. So more about this. What became really more interesting and more relevant was not so much image-based. People talked about images, but they did so more in a metaphorical and story sense. So it wasn't really just a way of notating or representing in this way. The relevant aspects in the symbolic metaclass were really found in the character-based subclass. So things like tablature, lead sheets, although my jazz musician said, yeah, you know, it's really important to be able to read those, especially if you're a studio musician, da-da-da-da-da. Do you actually use them when you play? No, I don't need those. Sheet music, very important for classical musicians. You usually don't necessarily, especially in chamber and orchestral settings, you don't memorize. So you are reading from sheet music. It doesn't mean that you're not also listening, you're not also interacting and being social, but it's a different process, it's a different phenomenon, right? So that we have that going on, and then I kind of also made the distinction that when I say sheet music, generally speaking, Western notation, also cipher notation is something that's used in Chinese music, also Indonesian gamelan music is usually written, it can be. In cipher notation, that is a way of representing pitches of a scale through numbers. So say if you have a pentatonic scale, penta 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so then you have, and it's a movable scale, so if I'm in G, 1 is G, if I'm in D, 1 is D. So it's a movable do. And it's a way of saying, you know, this is the scale degree, and you can have little dots or markings to indicate bends or things that you do. And the last example is ABC notation, which is something that we use in Irish music, and the fiddle player did mention that. No, I can't read ABC. You know, a lot of people find it useful. That's a way of representing a melodic line in a treble clef using ASCII characters. So using the musical alphabet A through G, and then numbers to indicate duration, and you have certain things before the melodic line that indicate meter and all of this stuff. So it's a shorthand, really, it's quick for retrieval. You can store a zillion little ABC notated files in the system and retrieve them like that because it's just ASCII characters. And so the interpretive metaclass, the things that were described here, especially in the machine-generated area, these were the format is not so important. So say a performance on YouTube is still a human-generated performance, and everybody was very clear about that. But the one example that I got, and machine-generated was not as important here, but the electronic tambura, which is the drone in Indian classical music, that was something mentioned that, you know, when she was playing behind him, and all the students waited for that opportunity where they could play the drone. And now he said, you know, you can get your drone going electronically, and you don't have to do that anymore. And so the most important, significant subclass is human-generated sound. So performances on human voice and instruments, and the location of that performance can be anywhere. It can be in front of you, it can be online, distributed, recorded. And so what also was interesting is the intersection between the derivative and the interpretive class really came in when people were remembering performances. And the memory of the performances were still absolutely tangible, present entities. And they actually influenced how people processed certain pieces, certain musical figures, certain styles. And I mean, to me it's not earth-shattering, because I think anyone who's a musician has had that experience when you've got a memory of a performance. And even if you're not a musician, you are still impacted. Usually you've had an experience where you've been moved by a performance, and even if you haven't had the opportunity to then translate that into what you're doing in performance, it's still definitely there. So this was the most intriguing area, and I knew it would be, because the devil's always in the details. And the good stuff is always in the kind of vague area too. So the descriptive area was really not quite as interesting, because folks talked about metadata like title and geographic places, composer sometimes, and in Carnatic music, the lyrics became especially important, as well as actually in Lakota song. Lyrics are not just a way of telling a story, but they also have spiritual connotations, so they're very, very important. And the experiential and participatory subclasses were by far the most fascinating. And the experiential stuff was related to emotion and experience, cognition, what's going through your mind and how you're processing, even intuition to some extent, and this type of time-based understanding that I'm roughly calling temporal epistemology, because it just seems fitting. It's a way of knowing through time, and memory factors in there, as well as the experience of talking about music. And that was something I did not anticipate. So the talking about music happens not only when you're, say, in rehearsal and you're talking between folks and you're trying to coordinate something, and the jazz pianist talked about how, you know, it's not so much important knowing this sort of background information. You know, I don't need to know tons about the composer, because I can feel it. And what's more important to me is the idea of someone in my ensemble saying, you know, here's what I was thinking when I was, you know, doing this arrangement, and, you know, so then the rest of the ensemble can kind of get in that place to then be able to play the piece in that way. So they're sort of collectively experiencing as well this affect. And talking about music was also, at a meta level, it was really the experience of interviewing people. I found that actually my interviews were, in fact, a music information object, because in talking about it, these memories and these stories and the emotional effect of what we were talking about was just really like the process of creating music. It was a thing itself. And the participatory aspect was primarily manifest, say, in Indian classical music, in Ugandan music, the idea of involving your audience, even the audience's experience is a way of them participating. It was viewed as participation. So just knowing that your audience either understands the religious text that you're singing, that's participatory. They're experiencing it, but they're participating in the religious aspect because they also understand the song. And this also came up too with talking about Lakota song. That any observer that's there is not really just an observer or an audience member, that you're participating because of your presence, that you're providing the people singing with energy, basically, and you're helping them sing. And with Caribbean steel pan music, the whole idea of Panorama, which is this huge steel pan festival that happens yearly, she talked about how when you're in a parade and you're, you know, going down the street with your parade and you're playing along, that somebody will jump in and start, you know, banging on something, and that you wouldn't really know if you weren't aware. If you're just a bystander, you wouldn't be aware that they weren't a part of the band officially, because they're participating. So the experiential aspect, I use this image because what really characterized this for me was talking about Indian classical music. And as well, the first aspect of this is memory and spirituality. So I've already touched on some of this, but song memory is so important in Lakota traditions. So it's not enough to have, you know, you don't want to have lyrics in front of you. You don't want to have it on your phone. You want to have this ability to not just memorize, because memorization is sort of this this work, but memory is a way of internalizing and knowing. And so song knowledge is about memory and making all of these connections and associations, and it's something that you have to learn over a period of time. You can't just digest it quickly. And so what really became important here was the idea of experiencing as much as you can, experiencing and hearing. In each of these, hearing and experiencing, as you might expect with music, is really, really important. And the spiritual aspect, there are kind of two categories of song. So there's religious song, and then there's social song and dance. And the religious stuff is much more secretive. So while it's important for the people there to experience and give energy and things like that, it's important for the spirituality of the religious song and dance for there to be audience members. In social dance, it's all about sharing and trading. And so the song will be passed around the drum, and you're expected to know where to pick up, where the person left off. And when it comes back around to the song leader must know, like a human recommendation system, or what is most relevant, to where did the song end up and where could we go from here. So they kind of curate the direction of the singing once again, and then it's traded around the circle. And with Chinese traditional music, there was a lot of discussion of spirituality and having memories of teachers and experiences, and also geographic places, that it's really important to know, to have a sense of nature, because nature factors into music a lot. And so having some frame of reference for these nature aspects is really essential to and central to the music. And spirituality, not for the Zhang, but for, I forget the name of it, there's so much terminology that I'm ill-equipped to carry around with me, but there's a smaller instrument that has about 5 strings, and this, I think it's the qing? Yes. Yes, awesome. Okay, all right. Yes, and she was talking about how it's really important to, she likes to be very quiet, and she likes to really think about what she's playing, because this is a quiet instrument. It's something unlike Zhang. It's a little bit more playing for yourself. So it's not so much a performance instrument, although she performs on it all the time, but historically speaking. And so I actually, anyhow, I've since, I see a lot of these people around. So I since saw her after our interview, and she was playing it and had the lights off, turned very, very low, and was playing it and talking about how she's getting in the right mind and relaxing, and that there's a lot to gather to be able to play this instrument. And so for the harpist as well, there were some very important memories for this person that related to some of the great figures in harp music and harp teaching. And so these memories that she had as a student carried very much into her own teaching, that the experience of seeing Marcel Grangy, who's one of the founders of 2 styles of harp playing and is one of the last of the harpist composers. Harper is what you call an Irish musician. And that experience was so transformative for her. And the Indian classical musician as well. I want to read you something, because it's too much for me to remember. But I want to read you, this is her memory, part of her memory. She actually talked for 15 minutes, and I said, so tell me about your musical background. And it was very, very, very long, very fascinating. But her experience of learning the sitar was sort of on, off, on, off, on, off. And it's very much influencing how she approaches her teaching and learning. So after 2 years of being away from the sitar, after playing as a child and a teen, more like a tween teen, you can't really play as a small child. She says, I was missing playing sitar for almost 2 years because, initially because of marriage and getting used to everything, I guess my music took a back seat. So I was sitting there, she's talking about in the car, as her husband went in to inquire about a vacant apartment. And she said she was hugely pregnant at that time too, and she was told, stay in the car, I'll go in. And I heard strains of sitar coming from somewhere. I just got out of the car. My husband didn't even know where I was, and went from house to house looking, where am I hearing this sound from? I found the sound coming from this one particular house. I was looking through the window and saw this gentleman playing, all lost, you know. And I don't know what happened to me. I barged into the house and I fell at his feet and said, "You have to teach me." So he was shocked. He said, you know, she burst out laughing, "Who are you? How did you come in?" So I told him, "So I've learned sitar and I'm missing it so much. I want to play. I want you to teach me." So he said, "Okay, you go and you practice for some time because you've not practiced for years. And so you go practice and you come back and show me and we'll see what I can do for you." And I think that was one of my best teachers. And so she was full of really fascinating stories. I mean, I could read you. That transcription is going to take me a while, I think. It's just so chock full of interesting things. And moving on from that, though, related to the whole idea of spirituality and memory, obviously emotion factors in there, cognition, what you're processing, and storytelling and just talking about music in general. These were so important, and actually these became, you know, objects themselves, which is really, really fascinating. And actually, I recently wrote a paper on memory, metaphor, and storytelling as alternative documents, and I didn't really think I would be getting so much support for that in my research here. But I totally did, and that was really interesting too, how important these things are, because if you're not dealing with musical traditions that are transcribed a lot, or maybe transcription is the wrong word, but most of the knowledge sharing happens person to person and orally and by rote, and while music is used, and it varies, you know, to what extent music is used and what kind of music is used, you know, sheet music or notation, it's still no substitute for really being able to learn something from a person and having all of these extra things shared with you. So emotion was something that everybody talked about, not surprising. Emotion factors into playing music a lot. Not just the piece of music, but yourself, and there's this whole